Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Mr. Bean Family Story Channel. This is where every day we bring you interesting, fun, and inspiring stories from the Mr. Bean family. You'll meet me, Mr. Bean, someone you're probably already familiar with, and I hope you love my son with his surprising and meaningful stories, and my lovely daughter, who always brings positive energy with stories that are close to life. Each day, one of us will share new stories, exciting journeys, and today is my turn. I'll take you on a fun adventure, but also with deep life lessons. Today's story carries a simple yet important message. Never judge something by its appearance. Behind that appearance, there are always surprising things waiting for us. If you enjoy the lively atmosphere of our family, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any of our stories on this amazing journey. Share this video with your friends, family, and loved ones, and don't forget to leave your fun comments so I know what you think. Now let's dive into today's story and immerse ourselves in a world full of surprises. Let's go! Maggie Collins walked into the sleek showroom of Boston Luxury Motors, her boots softly tapping on the polished floor. The showroom was bathed in the soft glow of spotlights, the luxury cars displayed like pieces of art. She could feel the gaze of every employee, every customer, as she stepped in wearing nothing more than a simple white t-shirt and a pair of worn jeans. Her brown ponytail bounced slightly with each step, and her face, though calm, bore an unmistakable aura of confidence. Maggie wasn't concerned about how others might perceive her appearance. She'd made her peace with it long ago. In fact, it was a choice, one that aligned with the way she lived her life. Despite her immense wealth, she preferred simplicity. She'd learned that no amount of designer labels or high heels could change the essence of who she was, and she didn't need them to feel significant. As Maggie approached the front desk, a young salesman named Daniel greeted her with a polite smile. His eyes, though curious, didn't hold judgment. "Good morning, ma'am. How may I assist you today?" "I'm looking for something for my sister," Maggie replied, her voice steady but warm. "A car, the one in the corner." She gestured toward the sleek, midnight blue coupe displayed on an elevated platform. It glistened under the showroom lights, a true masterpiece of engineering. Daniel nodded and started to speak, but was cut off by a sharp voice from across the room. "I'll handle this," Blake Thompson, the sales manager, said, stepping toward them with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He looked Maggie up and down, his gaze lingering on her scuffed sneakers and casual attire, and his smile tightened, just enough to be noticeable. "May I help you, ma'am?" Maggie's face remained neutral, but she couldn't ignore the wave of disdain in Blake's tone. It was a familiar feeling, being judged by the way she looked, as if her clothes somehow dictated her worth. Still, she refused to let it affect her. "Yes, I'm interested in the midnight blue coupe," she said, maintaining her calm demeanor. Blake's lips curled into a thin smile. "Ah, the Azure Coupe, a limited edition, only 15 units produced this year," he began, his words dripping with condescension. "This particular model is by appointment only. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable looking at our used cars, ma'am." He gestured vaguely toward the back of the showroom, where less expensive models were parked. Maggie felt a slight tension in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She had been through this before. She had learned how to navigate such moments, even if they stung. "I'm really interested in this one," she replied, her voice unwavering. "Is it possible to see the interior?" Blake's smile faltered for a moment, and he glanced around as if searching for another excuse to dismiss her. He quickly recovered, his tone becoming even more patronizing. "As I mentioned, this car is by appointment only. We don't typically show it to just anyone, you see." He gestured toward a couple that had just walked in, well-dressed, confident, and clearly part of the right crowd. He turned back to Maggie, his voice even colder. "Why don't you take a brochure instead?" Maggie's lips pressed into a thin line, and she fought to keep her emotions in check. She had come here for one reason, to buy her sister a car for her 40th birthday, a gift she hoped would show just how much she cared. But as she stood there, the reality of the situation hit her. This man wasn't interested in selling a car to her. He had already decided she didn't belong in his world. She glanced at Daniel, who stood by, clearly uncomfortable with the way things were unfolding. She could see the conflict in his eyes. He wasn't part of this charade. She appreciated that. "I'd like to see the car," she repeated, her voice calm but firm. Blake, now clearly frustrated, glanced over at the Harringtons, the wealthy couple who had just entered. He made a deliberate move to attend to them, all but ignoring Maggie in the process. "Excuse me," he said dismissively, turning away. "Please speak with Daniel." Maggie watched as Blake led the Harringtons to the Azure coupe, his earlier words about appointments only clearly forgotten. He opened the door with a flourish, inviting Mrs. Harrington to take a seat in the very car he had just claimed was off limits. Maggie's eyes narrowed, but she remained composed. She wasn't here to play games, but she wasn't going to back down either. As she turned to Daniel, who had been standing quietly by, she saw the apology in his eyes. He clearly hadn't expected this to happen. Maggie offered him a small, understanding smile. "It's okay," she said quietly. "I understand how these things work." Daniel hesitated for a moment, still looking uncertain, but then nodded, eager to do right by Maggie. "I can still tell you more about the Azure if you'd like." His voice was sincere, as if he was trying to make up for Blake's behavior. Maggie appreciated his willingness to assist, though she knew it was likely a futile effort in a place where appearances seemed to matter so much more than integrity. She smiled faintly and nodded. "I'd like that. Thank you." As Daniel began to enthusiastically explain the features of the Azure coupe, the rare details, the custom options, the exclusivity, Maggie's mind wandered. She could see the car in her mind's eye, imagining her sister, Caroline, behind the wheel, her face lighting up in pure joy. It had been a long, tough year for Caroline, one filled with treatments and recovery after a battle with breast cancer. Maggie had watched her sister fight, and now that Caroline was on the other side of it, she wanted to give her something that would mark the victory. Something more than a material gift, something that would make Caroline feel seen, cherished. But it was becoming clear that in this place, her intentions didn't matter. What mattered was the judgment she faced from someone like Blake, who looked at her not as a person with a purpose, but as a problem to be dismissed. His treatment was as much about class as it was about appearance, and Maggie was no stranger to the weight of such treatment. She turned her gaze back to Blake, who was still preoccupied with the Harringtons. He was practically showing them the car as if it were already theirs, his sales pitch oozing with the confidence that only comes when someone believes they've already won. And yet Maggie wasn't even angry. Not truly. She felt pity, a quiet sorrow for the man who didn't realize that respect for others was something that couldn't be bought. It was earned, through kindness, through understanding. And Blake had yet to earn it, at least not from her. The quiet murmur of conversation in the showroom intensified as more customers glanced at the scene unfolding before them. Maggie wasn't sure if they were watching because they were curious or because they were complicit in the judgment. Either way, it was starting to feel suffocating. She had half a mind to turn and leave. After all, she could buy the car from anywhere. But something held her in place. It wasn't pride. It wasn't ego. It was something deeper. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Blake turned back toward her, his smile now thin and strained. He cleared his throat, as if recalibrating himself for the next round. "Ms. Collins," he said, addressing her with a forced politeness that didn't quite hide his disdain. "I believe you wanted to know more about the car. If you're serious about purchasing, I'd suggest we set up a formal appointment." Maggie's brow furrowed slightly at the mention of an appointment. She didn't need an appointment. She needed respect. But she didn't say this out loud. Instead, she nodded, her composure intact. "I'd like to purchase it today, Blake," she said, her tone even, but with a certain quiet finality. Blake's eyes narrowed. "A purchase today, ma'am?" He laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Let me be clear. That vehicle is well beyond what most people are prepared to spend. You'll need to—" "I'm prepared," Maggie interjected calmly, not wanting to let him continue with his presumptions. She could see Blake's expression falter. He was caught between disbelief and arrogance, struggling to reconcile his assumptions about her with the reality she presented. His eyes flickered over her, as if trying to find an angle to challenge her claim, but there was nothing left to argue. "Well," Blake started, clearly flustered now, I'm sure you'll want to check with your financials first. You'll need proof of funds and I have the funds, Maggie said, her voice quiet but unwavering. She wasn't going to let him continue patronizing her. For a moment, there was a tense silence. It felt as if time had slowed down. The showroom was no longer just a place to buy cars. It was a battlefield of pride and assumption. Blake finally realized his error, not only in how he treated her, but also in how he underestimated her. The tension was palpable. It was almost as if every eye in the room had turned toward them, sensing the imminent confrontation. Maggie didn't mind the attention. She didn't mind standing her ground, even though she was the one being wrongly judged. Her resolve had never been stronger. But then, just as Blake opened his mouth to respond, a new voice interrupted, smooth and calm, cutting through the air with authority. Is there a problem here? Maggie's heart skipped a beat as the voice registered in her mind. She turned to find Richard Mason, the owner of Boston Luxury Motors, walking toward them, drawn by the disturbance. His presence immediately commanded attention. Blake's face drained of color as he saw Richard approach, and he straightened himself in a futile attempt to regain control of the situation. No problem at all, sir. Just explaining our policies here, Blake stammered, a nervous smile playing at the edges of his lips. But Richard Mason didn't seem fooled. His eyes flicked from Maggie to Blake, assessing the situation in a heartbeat. I see, he said slowly, his gaze lingering on Maggie's calm, dignified face. Well, let's hear it then. The morning sun filtered through the large glass windows of the dealership, casting long beams of light across the gleaming cars that sat like trophies, waiting to be admired. Maggie stood silently as Richard Mason, the owner of Boston Luxury Motors, approached. His presence was commanding, and though he appeared calm, there was an undeniable intensity in his eyes as he assessed the situation. Blake Thompson, now visibly uncomfortable, stepped back, his posture stiff. Mr. Mason, he began, his voice far more guarded than before. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. Maggie didn't bother to look at Blake. She was too focused on Richard, who was now standing directly in front of her. He looked her over, his expression inscrutable. She wasn't sure what he saw, perhaps the simple clothes, the modest appearance, but it didn't matter. Maggie wasn't there to make a point about her wardrobe. She was there to make a point about how people should be treated. I'm sorry you've had to deal with this, Richard said, his voice steady but with an edge of sincerity. I'll make sure we get things sorted. Blake, I think you and I need to have a conversation. Blake's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he nodded stiffly and stepped back, allowing Richard to take the lead. Maggie watched Blake retreat, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. Not because she wanted to see him suffer, but because she knew he had just learned something important. Something he would likely never forget. Richard turned back to her, his expression softening slightly. Let's go to my office and sort this out. I think it's important we talk. Maggie nodded, but before she could move, Daniel, the young salesman, stepped forward. He looked uncomfortable, but there was a sense of urgency in his eyes. Ms. Collins, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened, he said, his voice sincere. You should have been treated better. Blake, he can be, well, he's not the best with people sometimes. Maggie smiled at him, appreciating the gesture. Thank you, Daniel. I appreciate you speaking up. It's not your fault. Daniel looked relieved, but Maggie could see the weight of the moment still hung heavy on him. She knew that no matter how much he might have wanted to help, his position in the dealership wasn't enough to change the situation. It was clear to her that the issue was bigger than just one salesman's behavior. It was about an attitude, a mindset that she had encountered too many times in her life, especially in environments that valued material wealth above all else. Richard motioned toward his office, and Maggie followed him silently. As they walked through the showroom, she could feel the eyes of the other staff members on her. Some looked away quickly, likely embarrassed by the scene, while others didn't bother hiding their judgment. Maggie refused to let it affect her. The only thing that mattered to her now was the change she could make, whether here or elsewhere, and how she could turn this incident into something bigger than just a personal affront. Richard opened the door to his office and gestured for her to sit. He didn't sit immediately, though, choosing instead to lean against the desk, his arms folded. Maggie didn't take offense to his posture. She understood that he had to figure out how to handle the situation, especially with the eyes of the staff lingering outside the door. After all, this wasn't just about a customer complaint. It was about the image of his dealership and the kind of environment he allowed to thrive within it. "I owe you an apology, Ms. Collins," Richard began, his voice surprisingly calm. "This isn't the kind of place where people should be treated like that. Blake's actions were unacceptable. We'll make sure that something like this doesn't happen again." He paused, then looked directly at her. "But I also want to understand something. Why didn't you just walk away? Why come back here? What do you want out of this?" Maggie leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. The question was a fair one, and she had thought about it ever since she'd left the dealership the day before. It wasn't just about the car. It wasn't even about Blake or his behavior. It was about something much deeper. "I want people to understand that how you look on the outside isn't a reflection of your worth," she said quietly, her voice unwavering. "I want to raise awareness that judgment based on appearance is a serious issue. But more than that, I want to remind people that worth isn't determined by what you wear or how much money you have. It's about who you are, what you've done, and how you treat others." Richard listened intently, nodding slowly as her words sank in. "I see," he said finally, his tone thoughtful. "That's a powerful message. And you're right. I can tell you right now, we'll be making some changes. But this has to be bigger than just one incident." Maggie nodded, sensing the shift in Richard's demeanor. She had gotten his attention, and now maybe things could start to change. Richard shifted in his seat, clearly deep in thought. "I'm glad you came back today, Maggie. I think there's more to this than just an isolated issue with Blake. You're right. How people are treated based on their appearance, their background, it's something that needs to be addressed. I'm sure you've had your share of this kind of judgment, and it's unfortunate that it happens so often." Maggie felt a flicker of relief. At least Richard wasn't dismissing her, as Blake had done. He was taking her concerns seriously, but she couldn't allow herself to feel entirely satisfied yet. This wasn't just about Blake. It was about a larger mindset that needed to be shifted, not just within the walls of this dealership, but throughout society. "Thank you for understanding," Maggie said, her tone sincere. "But this isn't just about my experience. I want people to realize that this kind of treatment isn't unique to me. There are so many others who face it every day, who aren't in a position to just walk away to get the respect they deserve." Richard nodded again, his brow furrowing in thought. "You're right. This is a bigger problem than just a couple of bad interactions. And as a business, we have a responsibility to set a better example. If people are going to invest their time and money into our brand, it needs to reflect more than just luxury and exclusivity. It needs to reflect human dignity." Maggie's eyes brightened slightly. This was the kind of conversation she had hoped for. It was rare to find someone in a position of power who would acknowledge the issue so openly. She knew it wasn't going to be an easy fix, but at least there was an opening for change. "So, what's next?" she asked, her voice calm but determined. Richard leaned forward, clasping his hands together on the desk. "Well, first I'm going to have a conversation with Blake. There's no excuse for his behavior, and he needs to be held accountable. But more importantly, I'm thinking about implementing some changes here. Training on unconscious bias, maybe. Something that will help all of us understand how our perceptions influence the way we treat people." Maggie considered his words. "That's a good start," she agreed, "but it needs to be more than just a training session. It needs to be a culture shift. People need to be made aware of why these biases exist and how to actively confront them." Richard met her gaze, his expression more serious now. "I agree. That's why I'd like to bring in some experts on the subject. I'm thinking about reaching out to a few consultants who specialize in workplace diversity and inclusion. It's going to take time, but it's necessary." Maggie nodded, pleased with his response. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. "I think that's a great idea," she said. "And in the meantime, I'd like to do something that raises awareness about this issue, not just here, but in the broader community. We need to remind people that it's not the clothes you wear or the car you drive that define your worth." Richard's eyes lit up, and for a moment Maggie could see the wheels turning in his mind. What did you have in mind? Maggie took a deep breath, laying out the idea that had been forming in her mind since the moment she left the dealership the day before. I'd like to host an event, an open house of sorts, but with a twist. Instead of just showcasing the luxury cars, we'll invite people from all walks of life. We'll have discussions, panels, and even workshops on unconscious bias and human value. It'll be a chance for everyone to reflect on the way they see others, and for us to show that luxury isn't just about what you wear or what you own, but about how you treat people. Richard stared at her for a long moment, and then slowly he nodded. I think that's a brilliant idea. It would show the community that we care about more than just selling cars. We care about making a real impact, changing the way people think. I'm on board. Maggie felt a surge of hope. This was the kind of change she had been wanting to see. Real, tangible change that went beyond words and policies. It was something that would spark conversation, and if done right, it could inspire others to follow suit. Great, Maggie said, standing up from her chair. Let's make it happen. As she moved toward the door, Richard followed her. We'll start planning right away. I'll have my team get in touch with you about the details. Thank you, Maggie said, her smile warm but determined. I know it's going to take time, but we're making progress, and that's what matters. With that, Maggie left the office, her steps lighter than before. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but today felt like a victory, not just for her, but for anyone who had ever been judged unfairly because of their appearance. It was a step toward changing hearts and minds, one conversation at a time. The following weeks flew by in a whirlwind of meetings, plans, and discussions as Maggie and Richard worked to turn their vision for change into a reality. The dealership's management team was on board with the idea of an open event, and they even agreed to bring in diversity and inclusion experts to help guide the process. Maggie could feel the energy around her shift. There was a genuine commitment to making the dealership a more welcoming place for everyone, no matter their appearance or background. But despite the progress, there was still work to be done. Maggie could tell that Richard was doing his best to keep the momentum going, but she also saw that some of the employees, particularly Blake, seemed resistant to the changes. Blake was still the sales manager, still carrying himself with the same air of superiority, though there was now a slight edge of discomfort whenever he interacted with her. It was clear that he was struggling with the shift in the dealership's culture. Maggie wasn't interested in punishing Blake. She wasn't there to seek revenge, but she knew that his attitude would need to change if this new direction was to stick. She'd already given him the benefit of the doubt when he apologized, but she was under no illusion that a single conversation would be enough to break years of ingrained bias. Real change, she knew, was something that took time and effort, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. As the event drew closer, Maggie's anticipation grew. She had decided to use this moment to make a bigger statement, not just about Blake or the dealership, but about the world at large. The open house would be a space where people could come together, share their experiences, and challenge the assumptions that kept them apart. Maggie hoped that by bringing in people from all walks of life, those who had experienced discrimination, those who had perpetrated it unknowingly, they could begin to break down the barriers that divided them. It wouldn't be easy, and she didn't expect overnight success. But this event could serve as the first step toward changing the narrative. The day before the event, Maggie found herself standing in front of the dealership once more. The cars in the showroom were polished and gleaming, their shiny surfaces reflecting the bright afternoon sun. It was the same place where, just weeks ago, she had been dismissed and humiliated. But today, the energy felt different. Today, the space was filled with purpose. She felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that tomorrow would be a turning point. Not just for the dealership, but for herself as well. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. Maggie was no longer the person who would quietly accept judgment based on her appearance. She had learned to speak up, to stand firm, and to demand respect, not only for herself, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked or undervalued. As she entered the dealership, she saw Daniel talking with one of the experts they had brought in for the event. His face lit up when he saw her, and he waved enthusiastically. "Maggie, it's all coming together," he said, his excitement palpable. Maggie smiled. "I'm glad to see things are going well. Tomorrow's the big day, huh?" Yeah, and I think it's going to make a real difference. I mean, even Blake's been talking to some of the other salespeople about the training we're doing. I think he's starting to get it. Maggie raised an eyebrow. Blake, huh? That's interesting. You really think he's changing? Daniel's face grew a little more serious. I don't know. It's hard to tell, but at least he's willing to listen now. Maggie nodded, appreciating Daniel's honesty. Well, that's a start, but we've got a long way to go. Change doesn't happen overnight. Daniel agreed, his expression thoughtful. Yeah, but this could be the beginning of something. I really believe it. Me too, Maggie said softly. Let's just hope tomorrow is as impactful as we hope. The following day arrived with an electric energy in the air. Maggie could feel the excitement buzzing around the dealership as the staff made their final preparations. There was a sense of nervous anticipation, a mix of eagerness and uncertainty, as the team geared up for what would be an unusual day for Boston Luxury Motors. The grand showroom, usually reserved for high-end clients and exclusive car sales, was being transformed into a space of open conversation, learning, and awareness. Maggie had spent the morning organizing the various workshops, panels, and discussions that would take place throughout the day. The diversity and inclusion experts had arrived early to set up their stations, and the employees were slowly being gathered in small groups for brief introductions to the day's events. Daniel was there, helping to make sure everything ran smoothly, and even Richard had set aside his usual business persona, donning a more approachable demeanor as he welcomed guests. The stage was set for something transformative. However, as Maggie stood at the front of the showroom, taking in the sight of everything coming together, her mind couldn't help but drift back to Blake. She had seen him earlier, walking briskly through the showroom in his suit, his face slightly tense. Despite the changes she hoped would take root, she knew that Blake's past actions weren't so easily erased. He had made his judgments about her, and by extension, about others. It would take more than a few panels and discussions to undo years of that mindset. Still, she couldn't help but feel a small glimmer of hope. At least he was here today. At least he had shown up. Maggie approached him as he stood near a cluster of luxury cars, nervously adjusting his tie. His usual air of confidence seemed shaken, but there was a flicker of something different in his eyes. Perhaps regret, or maybe even curiosity. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, a reminder of the tension that had built between them since their last encounter. Blake, Maggie began softly, her voice steady but not unfriendly. I just wanted to thank you for being here today. I know this isn't exactly easy, but I think today can be an important step for all of us. Blake hesitated before answering, his voice low. I'm not exactly proud of how I treated you before, he admitted, but I'm here because, well, I want to learn. I know that I've got a lot to unlearn. Maggie nodded, appreciating his honesty. I'm glad to hear that. We all have something to learn, Blake. That's why we're here today. It's not just about changing policies or attitudes at the dealership. It's about changing ourselves, about understanding where our judgments come from and why they matter. Blake looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to process her words. Finally, he gave a small, reluctant nod. Yeah, I think I get that. I've been thinking about it a lot. Maybe I've been blind to some things. I'm ready to listen, Maggie. I want to do better. The sincerity in his voice was hard to ignore, and Maggie felt a sense of cautious optimism. She knew that this was only the beginning, but for the first time, she could see the cracks forming in the walls that Blake had built around himself. This wasn't a simple, I'm sorry. This was a man who was beginning to understand that change took time and effort. Maggie couldn't ask for more than that. Before she could say anything else, Richard stepped up to them, a wide grin on his face. It's good to see you two talking, he said warmly, his presence always commanding but kind. We've got a full day ahead of us, and I'm looking forward to seeing how everyone handles the discussions. Let's make sure we take full advantage of this opportunity, all right? Maggie smiled at Richard, her heart lifting at his unwavering support. Definitely, I think we're on the right track. The event kicked off in earnest shortly after, with small groups moving between the various workshops and discussions set up around the showroom. Maggie was moved by the level of engagement. People who had once been indifferent to these issues were now listening, learning, and even asking questions. The energy in the room was contagious, and it felt like the walls between the salespeople, the customers, and the experts were starting to break down. Blake participated in several of the panels, his previously stony demeanor softening as he absorbed the conversations around him. Maggie could see him deep in thought, and though he still had much to learn, she couldn't help but feel hopeful about what the day might bring. Every small step toward understanding felt significant. As the afternoon wore on, the final panel began, and Maggie took a seat in the front row, her eyes scanning the crowd. There were still some skeptics in the room, people who were reluctant to fully embrace the message. But overall, the atmosphere had shifted. The dialogue was more open, the judgments less sharp. Maggie smiled to herself, knowing that the work they had started today wasn't just about a single dealership or a single person. It was about creating a ripple effect, one that could eventually reach far beyond the confines of Boston luxury motors. The event ended with applause, but Maggie's mind was already racing toward the next step. This day had been important, but it was just a small piece of the larger puzzle. She knew that there was much more work to do, and she was ready for it. As people filed out, some with newfound perspectives and others with just a bit more understanding, Maggie felt a quiet sense of accomplishment settle over her. She had done it. She had made a difference. The days following the event were filled with a sense of cautious optimism. Maggie had hoped for change, but even she was surprised by the impact the open house had on the dealership. Employees who had once been indifferent were now actively participating in discussions. Blake, though still struggling with his old habits, was trying, really trying, to engage in a way he hadn't before. His conversations with Daniel, who had once been the youngest and most eager of the sales team, were becoming more frequent, and Maggie could see the shift in Blake's attitude. But change, Maggie knew, didn't happen overnight. While the event had been a huge success in terms of raising awareness and sparking conversations, she was realistic about the long road ahead. For one, she still had to deal with the ongoing resistance from some of the older employees who had been entrenched in their ways for decades. Their reluctance to embrace the new culture was more subtle, but just as potent. Maggie often found herself reflecting on her own journey during this time. The frustrations she had faced at the dealership weren't new. She had encountered similar biases in her career, especially when people assumed she wasn't capable because of how she looked or dressed. But this time, things felt different. She wasn't just a passive participant, she was actively challenging the status quo, pushing for something better not just for herself, but for others who felt overlooked or underestimated. That sense of purpose filled her with energy, and she threw herself into the next phase of the plan. It was time to follow up on the promise of lasting change. After discussing with Richard, Maggie had decided that the next step would be more direct engagement with the local community. She knew that the real shift had to come from inside the dealership, but it wouldn't hurt to get the community involved as well. The idea was simple: hold a series of outreach events in collaboration with the Collins Foundation, which would focus on inclusivity, empowerment, and understanding. As Maggie brainstormed with the Foundation's team, she could already see how the community outreach could create a lasting impact. The connection between the dealership and the Foundation was strong. After all, the dealership's name had been getting a lot of attention lately for hosting the event. Maggie hoped to turn that momentum into a genuine partnership that would resonate with people in the city. They could create programs that would teach people the importance of equity, showing that luxury wasn't just for the elite, but for anyone who valued respect, regardless of their financial standing. The first of these outreach events was scheduled for the following month, and Maggie felt a mix of excitement and nerves. She knew it would be a challenge, but that was exactly what she was looking for. A challenge was what had driven her to build the Collins Foundation in the first place, and now it was the fuel that kept her pushing forward. As the day of the first community outreach event drew closer, Maggie felt a familiar sense of anticipation, a mixture of excitement and nerves. She was accustomed to working behind the scenes, building something from the ground up with the Collins Foundation, but this felt different. It wasn't just about creating awareness or educating others anymore. This was personal. This was her chance to not only inspire, but to also show the world the kind of impact a united community could have when they worked together toward a common goal. The venue for the event was the local community center, a place where families, children, and individuals from all walks of life could come together. Maggie was determined to make sure the event would be inclusive and accessible, not just for the privileged few, but for everyone. She wanted people to walk away with something valuable, something they could use to make real change in their own lives and communities. As the day of the event arrived, Maggie was greeted by a crowd of excited faces, many of whom had participated in the dealership's open house just weeks earlier. Some of them had brought their families, others had come alone, but all of them were eager to be part of the change. The event was structured around a series of workshops and discussions, each one focusing on a different aspect of inclusivity, empowerment, and confronting bias. Maggie had personally handpicked the speakers and facilitators for each session, ensuring that they were not only experts in their fields, but also people who could speak from experience. Blake had also agreed to attend, though he had initially been hesitant. Maggie had insisted that he come as part of his own journey toward growth, and to her surprise, he had been more open to the idea than she expected. When she spotted him standing in the back, quietly observing one of the workshops, she couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. He wasn't just showing up out of obligation. He was listening, learning, and absorbing the information around him. Maggie moved through the crowd, greeting attendees, listening to their stories, and exchanging words of encouragement. She saw faces lit up with curiosity, people eager to be part of something bigger. The event had brought together a diverse group of people, some of whom had faced discrimination and marginalization, and others who had never had to experience it but were willing to learn and grow. That was what Maggie had hoped for when she envisioned these outreach programs, a place where understanding could blossom and where people could connect despite their differences. At one of the panel discussions, an elderly woman shared her experience of growing up in a racially segregated neighborhood and the barriers she had faced throughout her life. As Maggie listened, her heart ached for the struggles this woman had endured, but she also felt a deep sense of gratitude that this conversation was finally happening openly, without judgment. Blake had stepped into the room by then, looking around at the diverse group of attendees, and Maggie saw a shift in his expression. He was no longer the smug, dismissive salesman who had scoffed at her mere presence weeks ago. He was taking it all in, the stories, the faces, the undeniable human connections that were forming right before his eyes. And for the first time, Maggie allowed herself to feel hopeful that Blake might truly be on the path to change. By the end of the event, Maggie found herself reflecting on the incredible progress they had made in such a short time. It wasn't perfect, and there was still so much work to be done, but she could already see the seeds of change taking root. People had begun to question their assumptions, to engage in conversations that they might have once avoided. They were thinking critically about the way they viewed others, and more importantly, how they treated them. As the last of the guests filtered out of the community center, Maggie stood outside, watching them leave with smiles and renewed hope. She felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing that this was just the beginning. There would be many more events like this, more opportunities to reach people, to teach them that change was possible, and that it started with a single, brave step. Blake approached her, his expression thoughtful. "I didn't expect it to be like this," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "But I'm glad I came." Maggie smiled, her heart full. "I'm glad you did too, Blake. This is just the start. But every step we take, no matter how small, is a step towards something better." Blake nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a newfound respect. "I think I'm starting to understand that." Maggie had always believed that change started from within, but lately she was beginning to understand that sometimes change could also be sparked by something as simple as a conversation. The community outreach event had been a success, but Maggie knew that the real work was just beginning. The transformation of Boston Luxury Motors, from a dealership that operated on old assumptions to one that embraced inclusivity, was still very much a work in progress. Over the next few weeks, Maggie found herself spending more time at the dealership, working closely with Richard and the team to monitor the progress of the new initiatives they had put in place. The training on unconscious bias had been rolled out, and while some employees had embraced it wholeheartedly, others, Blake included, were more reluctant to fully commit. Still, there were moments of progress. Blake had started making small changes in how he interacted with customers. His interactions were less dismissive, though there were times when Maggie could sense the old patterns resurfacing. Maggie didn't expect perfection, but she did expect effort, and she could see that, at least for Blake, the effort was there. It was just a matter of time before the internal changes were reflected in the way he conducted business. But time, Maggie knew, was a luxury not everyone had. One afternoon, while Maggie was reviewing some new foundation initiatives in her office, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel, the young salesman who had stood by her during the earlier days of the dealership's transformation. His message was simple but urgent. "Maggie, I think you need to come down here. There's been a situation." Her stomach sank as she read the words. Daniel never sent messages like that, and the tone of his text suggested something serious. Maggie didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and headed straight for the dealership. When she arrived, the scene inside was tense. A couple of well-dressed customers stood in the showroom, visibly frustrated, while Blake was standing off to the side, looking uneasy. Daniel met her at the door, his expression grim. "It's Blake," Daniel said, his voice lowered. "He's been, well, he hasn't been treating them with respect. They're about to leave, and I think he might have lost the sale." Maggie felt a sharp pang of disappointment, but she kept her composure. Blake had come a long way, but it seemed like his past habits were hard to shake. "Where is he now?" she asked, her eyes scanning the showroom. Daniel gestured toward Blake, who was still talking to the customers, though his body language was closed off and defensive. Maggie could hear snippets of the conversation. "This model's only for serious buyers, not just anyone." The words were dismissive, even though the customers were obviously interested in making a purchase. Maggie walked toward Blake, her steps purposeful. She wasn't angry, at least not yet, but she needed to address this. She needed to understand what was going on and find a way to resolve it before it escalated further. "Blake," she said, her voice calm but firm as she approached him. He turned to face her, a flicker of guilt crossing his features. "Maggie," he said, his voice hesitant, "I didn't mean—" "I think you need to step outside for a moment," Maggie interrupted gently but assertively. "Let me handle this." Blake hesitated, but there was a moment of silence before he nodded and slowly walked toward the exit. As he passed by, Maggie could see the frustration in his eyes. He knew he had crossed a line. But what was harder to admit, even to himself, was that he didn't always know how to navigate the new environment Maggie was pushing for. Maggie turned to the customers, offering a polite smile. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," she said, her voice warm but authoritative. "If you'll give me a moment, I'll make sure you're taken care of." The couple exchanged glances, their frustration still evident, but they didn't leave. Instead, they waited as Maggie led them to a quieter area of the showroom. Once they were seated, she asked them to tell her what had happened. As Maggie sat down across from the couple, she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She could tell they were upset, but she didn't let their frustration affect her. Instead, she focused on the facts, listening carefully as they spoke. The woman, mid-30s, with an air of quiet elegance, spoke first. "We came here today because we've been looking for a high-end car for a while. We're ready to make a purchase. But Blake," she paused, her eyes narrowing, "he made us feel like we didn't belong here, like we weren't the type of people who could afford these cars." Her husband, standing slightly behind her, added, "We've been treated better at used car dealerships. He practically dismissed us the second he saw us walk in. We don't even want to buy from someone who thinks that way." Maggie's stomach churned. She had heard about this kind of behavior before, but hearing it directly from the customers stung. She could feel her pulse quicken as she processed the severity of the situation. It wasn't just about losing a sale. It was about the damage to the dealership's reputation, and more importantly, the damage to the culture they had been trying to create. "I'm deeply sorry that you had this experience," Maggie said, her voice calm but filled with sincerity. "I assure you, that's not the kind of treatment we want anyone to experience here. Blake is still adjusting to some of the new policies we've put in place. It's a process, and unfortunately, sometimes people slip back into old habits. The woman looked at Maggie, her expression softening slightly. We understand that change is difficult, but it doesn't excuse bad behavior. I mean, he practically told us we weren't serious enough because we didn't look the part. Maggie took a deep breath, trying to hold on to her composure. I get it. And you're right. It's not acceptable. I'll make sure this situation is addressed. I'd really appreciate the opportunity to show you the kind of service we strive to provide. The couple exchanged a look, clearly torn between wanting to leave and giving Maggie the chance to make things right. Finally, the woman spoke again. All right, we'll give you another chance, but if this happens again, we won't be back. I understand, Maggie said, her tone firm but kind. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to make things right. I'll personally make sure one of our top salespeople helps you from here on out. After a few more pleasantries, Maggie led them to another part of the showroom where Daniel was waiting, ready to take over and show them the cars they were interested in. She made sure to introduce him, explaining that he would give them the full attention they deserved. As they walked away, Maggie turned and found Blake standing in the doorway, watching. His face was flushed with embarrassment, and for the first time in weeks, he looked truly remorseful. You're going to have to do better than this, Blake, Maggie said, her voice low but steady. This can't keep happening. You know better. Blake swallowed hard. I know. I don't know why I keep doing it. It's like I can't stop myself from judging people based on how they look. Maggie studied him for a moment, her expression softening. That's the work you have to do, Blake. It's not just about stopping bad behavior. It's about understanding why you do it in the first place. Why do you look at people and immediately think they don't belong here? He shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncomfortable with the question. I I don't know. I guess I've always been in a position where I didn't have to think about it. I was always the one who was in control, the one who had the power. Maggie nodded, knowing he was speaking the truth. I get it, but you can't keep using that as an excuse. The world's changing, Blake. People are changing. And if you want to keep up, you have to change too. Blake looked at her, his expression thoughtful. I want to change, I really do. I'm just not sure where to start. Maggie took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the conversation settle in her chest. Start by listening. Start by truly seeing people for who they are, not for what you think they should be. You don't have to have all the answers, but you do have to start asking the right questions. Blake nodded slowly, taking in her words. There was no immediate fix to his ingrained biases, but Maggie could see the shift in him. It wasn't much, but it was a step, and sometimes that was all it took. I'll try, Blake said quietly. That's all I'm asking for, Maggie replied. Just try. Every day a little better. Maggie's phone buzzed early that morning with an unexpected message from Richard Mason. It was a simple note, but the words made her heart skip a beat. Can you meet me at the dealership today? I have an important update regarding Blake. She quickly responded with a confirmation, her mind racing. The past few weeks had been full of progress, but she knew that real change wasn't linear. Blake had been making an effort, but Maggie wasn't naive. She understood that his transformation was far from complete. The question now was whether he was ready to truly commit to the work that lay ahead, or if he would slip back into old patterns once the pressure started to mount. When she arrived at Boston Luxury Motors, Richard was already waiting for her in his office, looking unusually serious. The usual friendly smile was absent, replaced by an air of concern. As Maggie walked in, she could sense the gravity of the situation. Good morning, Maggie, Richard said, gesturing for her to sit. I'm glad you're here. I wanted to update you on Blake's progress. And I'll be honest, it's complicated. Maggie sat down, her expression soft but attentive. What's happened? Has something gone wrong? Richard hesitated for a moment before continuing. Blake has been trying. I won't deny that. He's been attending the diversity workshops, engaging more with the team, and even taking time to mentor some of the younger salespeople. But there's a problem. It's not just about the actions anymore. I've noticed a shift in him. It's like he's struggling to accept that the change goes deeper than just behavior. It's about his entire mindset. Maggie felt a knot form in her stomach. She knew that changing the way someone thought wasn't easy, especially when that person had spent years reinforcing harmful biases. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously, already preparing herself for the worst. Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. Blake's been having a hard time letting go of the notion that some customers are more worthy than others. I've overheard conversations where he still makes those judgments, comments about people's fit for luxury cars, or how out of place they look in the showroom. It's as if he's stuck at the surface level of these changes. I'm starting to question whether he fully grasps the gravity of what we're trying to build here. Maggie's heart sank. She had hoped that Blake was making genuine progress, but now she could see that his efforts were only skin deep. The thought of confronting him again felt draining, but she knew that if he was truly going to change, they couldn't avoid this conversation. "Is he aware of how far he still has to go?" she asked, her voice firm but measured. Richard looked down for a moment, clearly conflicted. "I think he knows on some level, but he hasn't truly confronted it. And that's the problem. He's been focusing on the external actions, the way he talks to people, the way he interacts with the staff. But it's the internal work that still needs to happen. He needs to understand why those judgments still exist and why he's holding on to them." Maggie nodded slowly, understanding the root of the issue. "It's not enough to simply act different, Richard. It's about changing the way he sees the world and the people in it. If he's not willing to examine his beliefs and values, nothing will change." Richard met her eyes, a flicker of frustration in his gaze. "I agree, but I don't know how to make him see that. He's still holding on to these biases like a crutch. I'm afraid that if we don't address this soon, it could undo everything we've worked for." Maggie sat back in her chair, thinking carefully. "I think we need to approach this differently. Blake needs to confront his biases head on, not just in a workshop or a training session, but in a way that forces him to face the real consequences of his actions. We can't let him continue to function at the surface level. He needs to truly reckon with the harm his mindset is causing, both to customers and to the people around him." Richard's expression softened, and for the first time, Maggie saw the weight of the situation sink in for him. "What do you propose?" Maggie took a deep breath, her thoughts swirling as she considered her next steps. She knew that simply talking to Blake again wouldn't solve the problem. It would take something more direct, something that would push him to confront the deep-seated biases that were still at play. He needed a moment of clarity, something that would make him see, in no uncertain terms, the impact of his actions and mindset. "I think Blake needs to be put in a situation where he's forced to challenge his beliefs, where he can't avoid the reality of how his judgments affect people," Maggie said thoughtfully, her voice steady as she outlined her plan. "We've created this space for learning and growth, but it's still too easy for him to retreat into old habits. We need to make him see the consequences of his behavior." Richard looked at her, intrigued. "You mean force him to confront it head on?" "Exactly," Maggie replied. "We've been giving him opportunities to learn through the workshops and discussions, but what he needs is a more personal experience, something that will take him out of his comfort zone. It's one thing to talk about bias and judgment in a theoretical sense, but it's another thing entirely to see how those things affect real people, especially the ones he's been dismissing." Richard sat back, considering her words. "So, what are you suggesting? Some kind of immersive experience?" "Yes," Maggie said, her mind already racing with ideas. "I think Blake needs to spend time with people from backgrounds completely different from his own, not just in a superficial way, but in a way that forces him to engage with them, to understand their struggles and perspectives on a deeper level. It's one thing to hear stories, but it's another thing to live them, even just for a short time." Richard's eyes widened slightly as he processed the implications. "Are you suggesting that Blake spend time with people from lower-income neighborhoods? Or perhaps even volunteer with those who have been directly affected by prejudice and discrimination?" Maggie nodded. "Exactly. If he's truly going to change, he needs to step outside the bubble he's been living in. He needs to face the realities that so many others live with every day. It's not enough for him to just talk about change. He needs to feel it, to see it firsthand." Richard was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing the idea. "And you think he'll go for it?" He's not exactly someone who enjoys being told what to do. Maggie smiled slightly, a spark of determination in her eyes. He may not like it, but he needs it. And honestly, if he's serious about changing, he'll understand that this is a necessary step. We can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not. Richard nodded slowly, a sense of resolve settling in. All right, let's do it. But we'll need to make sure that this is handled with care. We can't just throw him into a situation and expect it to work. It needs to be a structured experience, something that allows him to process what he's learning, not just react to it. Maggie's smile widened slightly. Agreed. We'll approach it thoughtfully. I think this will be the turning point for him. But we need to give him the right kind of support through the process. Richard stood up, extending his hand toward Maggie. Let's make it happen. I'll work with you to arrange everything. We'll find a way to make sure Blake understands the gravity of what he's doing and how much he stands to lose if he doesn't change. As Maggie shook his hand, she felt a sense of determination wash over her. This was a bold move, but sometimes bold moves were necessary for real change. She knew that Blake would be uncomfortable, but she also knew that discomfort was the only way to spark the kind of growth that would stick. It wasn't just about him fitting into the new culture. They needed to create a lasting shift in the way he viewed people. And that meant challenging everything he had ever believed. The following week, Blake found himself in a situation unlike anything he had ever experienced. Maggie's plan to force him to confront his biases had begun with a single phone call, a call that had set the wheels of his uncomfortable journey into motion. He hadn't been given much of a choice, though the promise of personal growth was enough to keep him from backing out. He was nervous, but also a little intrigued. Maybe this would be the wake-up call he needed. Maggie had arranged for him to spend a day volunteering at a community center on the outskirts of the city, one that served families from lower-income neighborhoods. It wasn't just a matter of showing up and doing charity work. Maggie's goal was much deeper. She wanted Blake to experience firsthand the disparities that existed in the world, to see the effects of bias, and to truly understand how his actions and assumptions had hurt others. As Blake pulled up to the community center, he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The building wasn't what he expected. The area was a far cry from the pristine, exclusive neighborhoods he was used to, and the building itself, while functional, showed signs of wear. He felt instantly out of place. His polished suit, the same one he wore to work at the dealership, felt like a glaring contrast against the modest surroundings. He couldn't help but notice the looks he received as he walked through the front door. The community center's interior was far warmer than the exterior. Bright murals decorated the walls, and the air buzzed with the energy of people working, chatting, and playing. Blake's discomfort grew as he stood in the entrance, unsure of what to do or how to engage. He had always been someone who led with authority, but here, that wouldn't work. He wasn't in control, and that thought rattled him more than he cared to admit. A woman in her mid-30s, wearing a simple but bright t-shirt and a warm smile, approached him. "Hi, you must be Blake," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Carla. I'll be showing you around today and helping you get started." Blake shook her hand, still feeling a bit like a fish out of water. "Nice to meet you," he muttered, his voice more stiff than he intended. Carla led him into a large room where children were coloring and playing, some working together on projects while others sat quietly at tables. "We have after-school programs here for kids in the neighborhood," Carla explained. "We provide everything from homework help to art and recreation activities. It's a safe space for them to be themselves." Blake nodded, trying to find a place for himself in the conversation, but his mind was already racing. This wasn't what he had imagined. He had thought the day would be about doing a few good deeds and checking a box, but it was quickly becoming clear that this was more than just a simple volunteer opportunity. The weight of the situation settled in as he watched the kids laugh, interact, and share stories, none of which were in a language of privilege or wealth. Blake was starting to feel the uncomfortable realization that these children and their families were living lives he had never truly considered before. Carla directed him to a table where a small group of children were working on a craft project. "Why don't you join them?" she suggested. "They love to have new people participate. It might be a good place for you to start." Blake hesitated. He was good at managing people, handling sales, and making deals, but sitting at a table with kids, many of whom were from completely different backgrounds, felt daunting. Still, he forced a smile and sat down. As the children talked and showed him their artwork, Blake listened, his mind racing. One of the kids, a boy around 10, looked up at him with curiosity. "What's your name?" the boy asked. "Blake," he replied, trying to keep his voice friendly. The boy grinned. "Are you rich?" Blake was taken aback by the bluntness of the question. "No, not exactly," he said, laughing awkwardly. "I work in sales. Do you like art?" The boy shrugged. "I like drawing. My mom says I'm good at it, but I don't have a lot of stuff to draw with at home." Blake felt a sharp pang in his chest as the boy's words sank in. He had grown up in a world of plenty, surrounded by opportunities, the best schools, and more material things than he could count. It was hard to even imagine a life without access to the basics. Yet here was this child, talking about drawing with whatever materials he could get his hands on. Blake couldn't deny the disparity between his world and the boy's. The boy's enthusiasm for something as simple as a crayon seemed to drive home how far removed he was from the realities other people faced. Blake sat there for a few moments, staring down at the child's simple drawing, trying to process the weight of what had just been said. He hadn't expected this experience to shake him to his core, but it was becoming impossible to ignore the reality that was unfolding before him. The boy, with his bright eyes and unfiltered honesty, was opening a window into a world Blake had never truly acknowledged. It was a world where material wealth didn't define success and where joy was found in the smallest of things, things Blake had taken for granted. "Do you think I'm good at drawing?" the boy asked, his voice pulling Blake back into the moment. Blake blinked and forced a smile, suddenly aware of how much his thoughts had drifted. "Yeah, I think you're really good," he replied, trying to sound more encouraging. The boy grinned widely, his earlier worries forgotten, and returned to his artwork. Blake's heart softened as he watched the child's fingers move expertly across the paper, completely absorbed in his work. In that moment, Blake realized just how little it took to make this child happy, and just how much he had always assumed that happiness had to come from expensive things. Carla, who had been watching Blake from a distance, approached him again, her face a mixture of encouragement and understanding. "How are you doing?" she asked softly, as if sensing the turmoil inside him. Blake exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. "It's a lot more than I expected," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "I thought I knew what it meant to struggle, but I had no idea what it's like to live without the basics, like not having enough to even buy art supplies." Carla nodded, understanding the shift in his tone. "Yeah, it's a tough reality, but these kids, they find joy in the little things. They're not looking for luxury cars or designer clothes. They just want to feel like they belong, like they matter." Blake felt a lump form in his throat. It was humbling, to say the least. All his life, he had been surrounded by the idea that success was measured by what you had, by the cars you drove, the clothes you wore, and the status you held. Now, sitting in this room surrounded by children who had so little in terms of material wealth, he was starting to understand just how wrong that thinking was. "What do you think I'm supposed to learn from all this?" Blake asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Carla smiled gently. "It's not about learning one lesson, Blake. It's about opening your eyes. It's about seeing the world as it is, not how you've always imagined it to be. These kids, they don't care about your suit or the car you drive. They care about whether you see them, whether you respect them, whether you're willing to treat them as equals." Blake's gaze flickered over to the boy with the drawing again, who was now showing his work to another child, clearly proud of what he had created. For the first time, Blake wasn't looking at him through the lens of superiority. He wasn't thinking about what the boy lacked, what he didn't have. Instead, he was seeing him for who he truly was, a kid with a passion for art, a kid who deserved respect just like anyone else. He felt the weight of Carla's words settle in. It wasn't just about stopping the behaviors that perpetuated bias. It was about fundamentally shifting the way he viewed people, the way he approached the world. It was about embracing equality, not just in theory, but in every interaction, every moment. As the afternoon wore on, Blake spent more time with the children, engaging with them in ways he never had before. He helped with crafts, played games, and even listened to some of the kids' stories about their lives. Each interaction chipped away at the old version of himself, the one who had walked into the dealership with his judgments and assumptions. By the time the session ended, Blake was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. He had learned more in these few hours than he had in the past few months of training. The real work of transformation, he realized, wasn't about talking the talk. It was about doing the hard work of listening, seeing, and understanding. As he gathered his things and prepared to leave, Carla approached him one last time. "You did good today, Blake," she said with a small smile. "But remember, this isn't a one-time thing. You've got to keep doing the work, keep listening, keep learning. It's a journey, not a destination." Blake nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time, he felt ready to take that journey, no matter how difficult it might be. And for the first time in a long while, he knew that the change he needed to make was real, not just for the dealership, but for himself. Blake had spent the past week trying to process everything he'd experienced at the community center. Every moment, every conversation he'd had with the children, every interaction with Carla had left him feeling unsettled in a way he wasn't used to. He'd been living in a bubble of privilege for so long, unaware of the realities that existed just outside his world. But now, with each passing day, the walls of that bubble were starting to crack. He could no longer ignore the inequality, the biases, the assumptions that had been ingrained in him for years. He arrived at the dealership early the next morning, his mind still swirling with everything he'd learned. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to rush into his usual routine. Instead, he paused outside the showroom doors, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. Today felt different. Today, he wasn't just going through the motions. Today, he was going to make a change, not just in his behavior, but in his approach to the entire job. Inside, the dealership was quieter than usual. The hum of daily operations was there, but the energy felt subdued. Blake spotted Maggie talking to a group of salespeople in the corner of the showroom. He hesitated for a moment before walking over to her, unsure of how to begin the conversation. "Maggie," he said, his voice carrying a hint of nervousness, "can we talk?" Maggie looked up, her eyes meeting his with a calm, knowing expression. "Of course, Blake. What's on your mind?" Blake took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about the work we're doing here and how far I still have to go. I can't keep pretending that I've made all the changes just by attending workshops or saying the right things. I need to do more. I need to be better. And I'm not sure where to start, but I know I can't keep avoiding it." Maggie nodded, her expression softening with understanding. "Blake, this is a process. It's not about getting it perfect right away. It's about taking responsibility and making a real effort. I'm glad you're realizing that, but you're already on the right track." Blake paused for a moment, looking around the showroom. "I've been reflecting on how I treated people, especially the ones I dismissed because they didn't fit into my idea of what a customer should be. And I realize that I've been doing that my whole life, not just here, but everywhere. I've judged people based on how they look, how they dress, where they come from, and I've missed out on so much. I've been blind." Maggie smiled gently, a glimmer of pride in her eyes. "You're not alone in that. It's easy to fall into those patterns, especially when you've been conditioned to think a certain way. But the fact that you're willing to face it now, that's what matters. That's where real change starts." Blake felt a weight lift off his chest. He wasn't expecting a pat on the back, but Maggie's words gave him a sense of hope. "I know it's not going to be easy. I can't just wake up and suddenly be a completely different person, but I'm ready to put in the work. I want to understand people, not just sell to them. I want to treat everyone with the respect they deserve, no matter who they are." Maggie nodded, her expression warm. "That's the right mindset, Blake. It's going to take time, but you're already making progress. Now it's about making those small changes every day in every interaction, whether it's a customer, a colleague, or anyone else you encounter. You have to remember that your actions speak louder than your words." Blake looked at Maggie, his resolve firming. "I'm ready to take on that responsibility. I just need your guidance and the guidance of the team to help me keep going." Maggie smiled. "We're all here to support you. This isn't just about you changing. It's about all of us working together to make this a place where everyone feels respected and valued." Blake spent the next several days reflecting on his conversation with Maggie and the promises he'd made to himself. He was determined to change, not just in the eyes of others, but for himself. It wasn't going to be easy, but he realized that he had to truly understand the people he was serving, not just sell them cars. And that meant confronting the uncomfortable truth about his own biases, no matter how deeply ingrained they were. The first few interactions of the week were a test. Blake had taken Maggie's advice to heart, approaching each conversation with a new mindset. It was small, but the change was noticeable. He found himself listening more, asking questions and looking past the outward appearances of his customers. He could feel the difference in the way he engaged. There was a sense of curiosity, of seeing the person in front of him as more than just a potential sale. But old habits die hard. When an upscale couple walked into the dealership one morning, Blake instinctively sized them up. The woman's designer handbag and the man's tailored suit screamed wealth, and Blake's thoughts immediately shifted to the high-ticket models they might be interested in. Yet this time, he caught himself. He stopped before making any assumptions and reminded himself to treat them just like anyone else. "Good morning," Blake said, his voice steady, though there was a hint of nervousness. "How can I help you today?" The couple smiled and the woman spoke first. "We're looking for something sporty, maybe a Porsche or a Ferrari." Blake nodded, keeping his tone neutral. "We've got some great options here. I'd be happy to show you a few of our most popular models." As they walked toward the luxury vehicles on display, Blake took a deep breath. He wasn't just trying to close a deal, he was trying to be present, to see this couple as human beings with wants and needs, not just as wallets waiting to be emptied. Half an hour later, after showing the couple several cars and answering their questions, Blake felt a sense of satisfaction that was different from his usual rush to make a sale. It wasn't about the commission, it was about the connection he had made. By the time the couple left without buying anything, Blake realized that it hadn't mattered to him. He had done his job well, not because of the price tags on the cars, but because he had given them his time and attention. Later that afternoon, Blake found himself reflecting on the experience. He had learned something important. The value of a person wasn't determined by what they could afford. It wasn't about flashy clothes or a luxury car. It was about respect, empathy, and the simple act of listening. The next day, as he prepared for another day at work, Blake was eager to put his newfound understanding to the test again. He was ready to keep making small changes in the way he interacted with people, to push past the biases he had once relied on so heavily. Each moment of discomfort, each internal battle, was just another step toward becoming the kind of person and salesman he wanted to be. As the week went on, Blake's progress became more visible. He was more engaged with his colleagues, especially the younger salespeople like Daniel, who had been one of the first to speak out in favor of Maggie's vision. Blake noticed how Daniel was treated differently by the staff. He was respected not because of his clothes or his background, but because of his attitude. Daniel treated people with genuine care, and Blake admired that. One afternoon, Blake found himself standing next to Daniel as they both watched a customer browse the cars. The customer, a woman in her late 30s, was dressed casually, nothing extravagant. Blake had to remind himself not to make assumptions, but his instincts still kicked in. She looked at a mid-range model, and Blake's first thought was that she wouldn't be interested in the high-end cars. But then, to his surprise, she approached him and said, "I'd like to know more about that sports car. I think it's exactly what I'm looking for." Blake nodded, taking a moment to pause before speaking. "Of course, it's a great choice. Let's take a look at the features, and I'll answer any questions you have." As they walked toward the car, Blake caught himself thinking about how different he would have approached the situation just a few weeks ago. Before, he would have assumed that someone dressed simply wouldn't be able to afford a high-end vehicle. Now he knew better than to make that snap judgment. The woman ended up purchasing the car, and Blake felt a quiet sense of pride. Not because of the sale, but because he had treated her with the same respect he would have shown anyone else. In that moment, Blake realized that he was no longer selling cars based on assumptions. He was building relationships, one interaction at a time. By the end of the week, Blake felt a sense of accomplishment, but he also knew that this was just the beginning. Change wasn't going to happen overnight, and it wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready for it. And as he glanced over at Maggie, who was working with a customer nearby, he knew that the journey they had started together was far from over. The progress Blake had made in the past few weeks was undeniable. Every day he felt more connected to the people he interacted with at the dealership. The uncomfortable assumptions he once held were being replaced with curiosity and understanding. The change was small, but it was real. Yet he still couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper needed to happen for him to fully shed his old way of thinking. One afternoon, as Blake walked through the showroom, he saw Maggie standing by a car with a customer, explaining the vehicle's features. She looked calm, confident, like she was in her element. Watching her, Blake couldn't help but feel a pang of admiration. She had always been different, someone who saw beyond the surface and truly connected with people. He knew that her efforts had been the catalyst for the changes happening at the dealership, but he was still struggling with how to fully embody her approach. Blake had been working on himself, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there were still parts of him, deep-seated habits and ingrained thoughts, that he hadn't fully confronted. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized he couldn't do this on his own. If he was truly going to change, he needed to have a difficult conversation, a conversation with Maggie, the one person who had consistently pushed him to face the truth. Later that day, after the showroom had quieted down, Blake found Maggie in her office. She was going over some documents, but when she saw him at the door, she put the papers down and gestured for him to come in. "Blake," she said warmly, "what's up?" He hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about everything lately," he began, "about the work we've been doing here and the changes I've been trying to make. But I still feel like I'm missing something, like I'm not fully getting it. I'm still holding on to some of the old ways of thinking, and I don't know how to move past them." Maggie raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "What do you mean?" Blake paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've been doing better with how I treat people. I've been trying to be more mindful of my judgments. But when it comes to customers, especially the ones who aren't dressed in designer clothes or driving high-end cars, I still find myself making assumptions. And I hate it. I hate that I'm still doing it, even after everything we've talked about." Maggie sat back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Blake, you're not perfect. No one is. Change isn't about flipping a switch and suddenly becoming a different person. It's about acknowledging the work you still need to do and being honest with yourself about it. You're on the right track, but you're right. There's more to confront." Blake's heart sank a little, but her words also gave him a sense of clarity. "So what do I do next? How do I stop these old habits from creeping back in?" Maggie leaned forward, her voice firm but encouraging. "You keep doing the work. You keep reflecting, keep challenging your assumptions. And when you catch yourself making those judgments, you call yourself out on it. You'll make mistakes, but the key is not to let them define you. The more you practice being present, being aware, the more those old patterns will fade away." Blake nodded, absorbing her advice. It wasn't an easy answer, but it was the truth. He wasn't going to change overnight. He had to commit to the process, even when it felt uncomfortable. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Maggie wasn't just giving him a pep talk. She was showing him that change wasn't about perfection. It was about progress. Blake left Maggie's office feeling a mix of relief and determination. Her words had given him a new perspective. He wasn't expecting to become someone else overnight, and he certainly wasn't expecting to be perfect. But he had to keep pushing forward, confronting the biases that had once been second nature to him. The following week, Blake found himself in yet another challenging situation, one that would test his resolve. A customer had walked in, a woman in her early 40s, dressed in modest clothing with an air of quiet confidence. She wasn't the type of customer Blake would usually have gravitated toward. He immediately assumed she wasn't here to buy anything expensive. He noted the plainness of her clothes, the lack of any obvious designer brands. His old habits began to surface. But this time, Blake caught himself. He paused, mentally reminding himself of what Maggie had said. He had made the mistake of judging before, but he wasn't going to do it again. He needed to treat this woman like any other customer. No assumptions, just respect. "Good afternoon," Blake greeted her, his tone warm and genuine. "How can I assist you today?" The woman smiled, not flinching at the warmth in his voice. "I'm interested in a new car. Something reliable but also a bit luxurious. I've heard good things about your dealership." Blake's mind briefly wandered to the high-end models on display, the ones he typically showed to customers who fit his expectations of success. But he steeled himself and led her to a few models, ones he knew would match her desires without making assumptions. As they walked around the lot, Blake found himself genuinely engaging with her. He asked about her preferences, her lifestyle, and what she wanted in a car. Not once did he think about what she might or might not be able to afford. The conversation flowed, and for the first time in a while, Blake realized how much he had been missing by narrowing his view of who his customers could be. The woman seemed to appreciate his sincerity, and by the end of the afternoon, she was ready to make a purchase. Not a flashy, overpriced model, but a well-maintained, beautiful vehicle that met her needs. When they finalized the paperwork, Blake couldn't help but smile at the transaction. It wasn't about the size of the sale, it was about the genuine connection they'd made. As Blake handed her the keys, the woman looked at him and said, "Thank you for your patience. I know it wasn't the most extravagant purchase, but you treated me like I mattered, not like I was just another sale." Blake felt a rush of gratitude wash over him. He had treated her with respect, not based on her appearance or assumed financial status, and it had made all the difference. He realized that it wasn't the luxury cars or the designer clothes that made a customer valuable. It was the respect they were given. As the woman drove off in her new car, Blake watched her go, feeling a sense of quiet pride. This was what Maggie had been talking about. It wasn't about changing overnight or always being flawless. It was about making the effort, about taking the time to see people for who they were, not what they wore or what they had. And with every customer, Blake was getting better at it. Later that afternoon, Maggie stopped by the showroom as she often did. Blake caught her eye and walked over, feeling the familiar nervousness creep in, though it was tempered with a new sense of self-assurance. "Blake, how's everything going?" Maggie asked, her smile warm as always. "I had a breakthrough today," Blake replied, his voice steady. "A customer came in who didn't fit the usual mold. I almost made the same mistake, judging her based on her appearance. But then I stopped myself. I treated her like I would any other customer, and she ended up buying a car. Not the most expensive one, but it felt right." Maggie's eyes softened with approval. "That's exactly what I've been talking about. It's not about the sale, it's about treating people with dignity and respect, no matter who they are. It's a small win, but it's a win nonetheless." Blake nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He knew that the work wasn't over. There would be more moments like this. Moments when he'd have to fight his instincts, when his biases would try to creep back in. But for the first time, Blake felt confident that he could face them head on. "I'm getting it," Blake said, a smile forming on his face. "I still have a long way to go, but I'm ready to keep going." Maggie smiled back at him, her expression proud. "That's all I can ask for, Blake. We all have a long way to go, but you're making real progress. Just keep pushing." As the day wound down and Blake prepared to leave, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt before. It wasn't just about the work he'd done on the showroom floor, it was about the work he was doing within himself, and that he realized was the most important part of the journey. Blake had come a long way since his first days at the dealership. Every day he made a conscious effort to step outside the bubble he'd built for himself, working tirelessly to break down the biases that had once guided him. But despite his progress, he knew the journey wasn't over. In fact, the real work was just beginning. One morning, as Blake walked into the showroom, he felt a subtle shift in the air. The dealership, which had once felt like a battleground of unspoken judgments, now seemed to pulse with a new energy. He could see it in the way the staff interacted with each other and with customers. There was a more genuine respect in the room, a quieter confidence that didn't come from status or money, but from a shared understanding that every person was worthy of dignity and respect. It was a small but significant victory. Maggie was already in the showroom, talking to a couple of customers as Blake walked in. He watched her for a moment, admiring her calm demeanor and the way she made everyone feel seen, regardless of their appearance or background. Maggie had become more than just a mentor to him. She had become the model of the kind of person Blake aspired to be. She had been patient, guiding him through his transformation, but she had also pushed him to confront uncomfortable truths. As Blake walked toward the sales desk, Daniel approached him, a slight smile on his face. "Hey, Blake, you're looking good today. Feeling good too." Daniel's tone was light, but there was something deeper behind the question, a genuine curiosity about how Blake was holding up. Blake smiled back. "Yeah, I think I'm starting to get it. It's a lot to process, but I'm feeling better about it. More like myself, I guess." Daniel nodded. "I can see it. You're really starting to connect with the customers. And the way you're working with the team, it's different now. People notice." Blake paused, taking in Daniel's words. "I still catch myself sometimes. Old habits die hard, right?" Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, but you're doing great. No one's expecting perfection, just progress." Blake appreciated Daniel's encouragement, but he knew he wasn't done yet. He still had moments when his old biases crept back in, even if they were fleeting. It was a constant battle, a quiet reminder that even with all the changes, the work was never truly finished. Maggie noticed their exchange from across the room and walked over. "You guys are getting along well," she said with a smile. "Blake, I wanted to talk to you about something." Blake raised an eyebrow, sensing the seriousness in her voice. "What's up?" Maggie leaned in slightly, her expression thoughtful. "There's going to be a team-building event next week, a day out of the dealership, a chance to work on our communication, trust, and team dynamics. I think it's time you start taking a leadership role in these activities. It's one thing to change how you approach customers, but leadership is a big part of it too." Blake felt a twinge of unease. He wasn't used to being in a leadership position, especially one that required him to take a step back and listen more than he spoke. But he knew Maggie was right. If he truly wanted to make lasting change, he had to be willing to lead by example. "Are you sure I'm ready for that?" he asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. "I mean, I'm still working on myself. Taking on a leadership role feels a little overwhelming." Maggie smiled reassuringly. "You don't have to be perfect, Blake. You just need to show up, be real, and be open to learning. Leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about guiding others through the same process of growth and reflection that you've been going through." "I think you're ready." Blake took a deep breath. This was a huge step. He had always been comfortable in the background, managing sales and numbers. But leadership, true leadership, meant putting others' growth above his own comfort zone. Blake spent the following days grappling with the idea of leadership. It wasn't that he didn't feel capable. It was the self-doubt that had always lingered in the back of his mind, whispering that he wasn't enough. He had spent most of his career hiding behind his sales skills, using his ability to close deals as a shield. Leadership, however, was a different kind of challenge. It required vulnerability, a willingness to open up to others and be seen not just as a boss or a superior, but as someone who was still learning, still growing. When the day of the team-building event arrived, Blake felt the weight of his uncertainty more than ever. The team had gathered at a retreat center a few miles outside the city, and the atmosphere was noticeably different from the polished showroom of the dealership. The outdoor setting, surrounded by nature, seemed to invite openness. Still, Blake couldn't shake the nerves bubbling inside him. Maggie had already arrived and was mingling with the team, chatting with the younger salespeople and offering encouragement. Blake watched her for a moment, noting how effortlessly she connected with everyone. She made it seem so easy. Her leadership wasn't about control. It was about creating a space where others felt heard, valued, and supported. As the rest of the team filtered in, Blake knew it was time. He had to step up. "All right, everyone," Maggie said, clapping her hands to get everyone's attention. "Let's gather around. Today isn't just about fun activities. It's about building trust, getting out of our comfort zones, and learning how to support one another. We'll be doing a series of challenges, and I'll be looking to each of you to lead, to step outside of your typical role, and help guide the team." Blake's heart raced. He wasn't sure if he was ready to lead the group through these activities, but he could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him. Maggie had put her trust in him, and he didn't want to let her or the team down. The first exercise involved a blindfolded obstacle course. The team had to work together to guide one blindfolded member through the course using only verbal instructions. Blake was chosen as the first person to be blindfolded, and as he stood there, preparing to be led by his team, he felt an odd sense of vulnerability. He couldn't see anything. The world around him was completely dark. He could hear the voices of his colleagues, but they all felt so distant. Maggie's voice cut through the silence. "Blake, you have to trust us. Let us guide you." The words hit him harder than he expected. Trust. It was the word he had avoided for so long. For years, Blake had built his career by relying on his own abilities, his own drive, and his own self-sufficiency. Letting go of control was not something he was used to, but as he stood there, unable to see and yet feeling the weight of his colleagues' trust in him, he realized that this was exactly what leadership was about. It wasn't about knowing everything or controlling every situation. It was about trusting others, being open to vulnerability, and guiding them to the best of his ability. As the activity continued, Blake felt his confidence grow. His teammates' voices became clearer, their instructions more precise, and he began to trust them. He let go of the old patterns, the need to be perfect, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to rely on others. They successfully navigated the obstacle course, and when the blindfold was finally lifted, Blake found himself grinning, a mix of pride and relief flooding through him. "Great job, Blake," Maggie said, her smile genuine. "That's what leadership is about. You can't do it alone. You rely on the team to help you get through the obstacles." Blake nodded, his chest swelling with gratitude. "Thanks, Maggie. I think I'm starting to get it." Maggie's eyes softened. "You're doing more than getting it, Blake. You're becoming the kind of leader this team needs." As the day went on, Blake found himself taking on more and more leadership responsibilities, whether it was guiding the team through another challenge or offering encouragement to his colleagues. The more he embraced the role, the more natural it felt. By the end of the day, Blake felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't known in a long time. He was no longer just the salesman trying to prove himself. He was someone who could step into a leadership role with authenticity and empathy. That evening, as the team gathered around a bonfire to close out the retreat, Blake sat back and reflected on the day. He had come into the retreat unsure of himself, but he was leaving with a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was still long, but he was ready for it. He wasn't the same Blake who had walked into the dealership months ago. He had changed. His mindset, his approach, and his values had all shifted. And for the first time, he was starting to feel like he truly belonged, not just in the dealership, but in the world Maggie had helped him see. Blake stood in front of the dealership one crisp morning, gazing out at the parking lot. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the luxury cars that gleamed under the early light. It was a peaceful moment, but in the back of his mind, he knew the real work was about to begin. After weeks of being at the helm, the weight of leadership had begun to settle in. It wasn't just about guiding his team, it was about making sure that the changes they'd all worked so hard for continued to take root. Maggie's influence had been the catalyst for much of the transformation, but now Blake felt a deep sense of responsibility to keep things moving forward. His role had evolved beyond simply selling cars. It was about shaping the culture, making sure everyone on the team understood what was truly important. It was about more than the deals. It was about the relationships they built, not just with customers, but with each other. The more Blake thought about it, the more he realized how much his own journey had mirrored the changes in the dealership. He wasn't the same person who had walked in months ago, unsure of his place. He had changed, and so had they. When Blake walked inside, he immediately noticed the subtle differences. The way the salespeople interacted with each other was different, more open, more supportive. The culture of competition had shifted to one of collaboration. Blake smiled as he saw Daniel and the newer members of the team huddled together, discussing their strategies and sharing tips on connecting with customers. It wasn't a perfect environment, but it was leagues better than it had been. Maggie was already in the showroom, talking to a customer. her calm demeanor as steady as ever. Blake had spent months watching her lead with patience, always guiding others without imposing her own vision. It was something he'd tried to adopt for himself, letting people find their own way while supporting them when needed. He knew that if the team was going to thrive, they needed to continue fostering that space for growth. It wasn't just about following a formula. It was about understanding the people who walk through those doors, seeing their needs, their struggles, and being present for them. As Blake approached Maggie, she smiled warmly, her presence as steady as the morning sun. "Blake, how's everything going this morning?" Blake took a deep breath, feeling a sense of clarity wash over him. "It's going well. I've been thinking a lot about the next steps for the team. I think we're at a crossroads. Things are changing, and we need to make sure that the culture we've worked so hard to build doesn't slip away. We need to keep evolving." Maggie nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I've noticed that too. It's a big shift, and change is hard. But it's important to keep pushing, keep challenging the team to grow and develop, to be comfortable with the discomfort of change. That's where the real growth happens." Blake felt a weight in his chest, a reminder of how much work still lay ahead. "Yeah, I agree. But it's not just about leading the team anymore. It's about keeping the vision alive, making sure we stay true to what we've started." Maggie looked at him, her gaze steady. "That's the key, Blake. You've already proven that you're capable of leading by example. Now it's time to help them do the same. Lead them to keep pushing forward, even when it's difficult." Blake felt the truth in her words. It wasn't just about maintaining the progress they'd made. It was about pushing further, always striving for more. He had become a leader, but he was still learning, still figuring out what kind of leader he wanted to be. The day continued with Blake's thoughts lingering on the responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. As the hours passed, he began to see the truth in Maggie's words. Leading wasn't about finding comfort. It was about constantly challenging himself and the team to break through limits, to rise above the surface-level changes they had made and delve deeper into what true transformation meant. By the afternoon, Blake had gathered the team for their weekly meeting. The conference room buzzed with the usual energy, but today felt different. There was a heightened sense of anticipation in the air, as if everyone knew this meeting would be about more than just sales targets and performance reviews. It was time to address the next step in their journey. As the team settled in, Blake stood in front of them, his presence commanding but not overbearing. He had come to realize that leadership wasn't about talking at people. It was about engaging with them, making them feel like they had a stake in what came next. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each team member. "Everyone," Blake began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next for us. The changes we've made, the progress we've seen, it's all been incredible. But I think we're standing on the edge of something even bigger. It's not enough to just maintain what we've done. We need to challenge ourselves to go further, to evolve." A few of the team members exchanged glances, but Blake continued, encouraged by the attention he was getting. "We're at a crossroads," Blake said, pacing slightly as he spoke. "We've made incredible strides in how we connect with our customers and how we support each other. But if we want to keep growing, we need to dig deeper. We need to take this beyond just the surface. It's time for us to redefine what success really means here." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle in. "Success isn't just about how many cars we sell or how fast we close a deal. It's about the impact we have on the people who walk through our doors. It's about making them feel seen, heard, and respected, not just as customers, but as human beings. That's the legacy I want us to leave." Blake's voice softened as he continued, the passion he felt for the vision shining through. "We've created something special here. We've turned a dealership into a place where people can feel safe, where they can trust us, not just with their money, but with their stories, their needs. And now it's time to take that to the next level. It's time for all of us to push the boundaries of what we thought was possible." There was a murmur of agreement among the team, but Blake knew he had to give them more than just words. He needed to show them how this would look in practice, how it would impact their day-to-day interactions with customers and with each other. "I want each of you to think about what success means to you, not just in terms of sales, but in terms of your personal growth, how you've changed since we started this journey. What do you want to achieve both for yourselves and for the people we serve? Blake looked around the room, his eyes meeting each member of the team. We're going to start pushing ourselves in new ways. We're going to continue learning, continue evolving. But more than anything, we're going to stay true to the core values we've built here: empathy, respect, and authenticity. These aren't just words on a wall. They're the foundation of who we are and what we stand for. A quiet but powerful energy filled the room. Blake could feel the shift in the air, the team rallying around the vision he had laid out. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about them, about all of them taking ownership of the changes they'd started and pushing them even further. They were ready to take the next step. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the dealership, Blake stood at the front of the showroom, taking in the progress that had unfolded over the past year. The dealership was no longer just a place for transactions. It had become a community, a space where both customers and employees felt seen and valued. Blake had come a long way from the man who once viewed success solely through the lens of numbers and sales quotas. He had evolved into a leader who prioritized relationships and trust, someone who truly understood the power of empathy and respect. The team had grown alongside him. They had built something together, something more meaningful than any luxury car deal. Every customer who walked through those doors now felt the difference. They were treated not as faceless buyers, but as individuals with needs, dreams, and stories. Blake knew that their success wasn't measured just in sales numbers. It was in the quality of the experiences they provided. Maggie walked up beside him, her usual calm demeanor radiating with quiet pride. She had been with him every step of the way, guiding him through his challenges and celebrating his successes. It was her belief in him that had helped him see the bigger picture, the importance of creating a culture where people mattered more than the bottom line. "You've done it, Blake," Maggie said, her voice steady but filled with admiration. "This place has transformed." Blake smiled, but it was a smile born of humility. "It's not just me, Maggie. It's the team. They've all bought into this vision. They're the ones who've made it happen." Maggie nodded, her gaze turning to the bustling showroom where the team was interacting with customers, laughter and conversation filling the space. It was clear she was proud of what they had achieved together. "True, but you were the catalyst. You took the leap, and you got the rest of them to follow." Blake felt a weight settle on his shoulders, but this time, it wasn't a weight of pressure. It was the weight of responsibility. Responsibility for continuing what they had started, responsibility for leading his team forward, and responsibility for staying true to the values that had brought them to this point. He had learned over the past year that leadership wasn't just about making decisions. It was about making sure everyone around him had the opportunity to grow as well. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Blake said, his voice thoughtful. "I don't want this to be a moment of success that we look back on and say, 'We've done it. We've made a change.' But change is never really finished, is it?" Maggie smiled, sensing where he was going. "It's ongoing. There will always be another challenge, another opportunity to grow." Blake nodded. "I want to make sure we're always improving. I want to keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible, not just with sales, but with the culture we've built. I want to be a leader who continues to evolve, who doesn't settle for anything less than the best for our team and our customers." Maggie's eyes softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "I have no doubt you'll continue to lead with that mindset. You're not just leading this dealership anymore. You're setting an example for others to follow, and that's how real change happens. It's not about one big moment. It's about the small, everyday decisions to do better, to be better." Blake looked around the showroom again, taking in the faces of the team that had supported him along the way. He saw their potential, their growth, and the pride they now carried with them. Each one of them had stepped up, just as he had, to build something lasting. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. "We've come a long way," Blake said, his voice full of conviction, "and I think we're just getting started." Blake stood for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. The dealership had transformed in ways he hadn't imagined, and so had he. The road he'd traveled, from the man who focused only on sales numbers to the leader who prioritized human connection had not been easy. There had been moments of doubt, setbacks, and uncomfortable realizations. But with each step forward, Blake had become a better version of himself, and the dealership had become a place where people felt respected, valued, and truly seen. His gaze shifted to the customers now browsing the cars. There was laughter, conversation, and a sense of warmth in the air. It was the kind of atmosphere Blake had always dreamed of, but never thought was possible in a business like this. People weren't just making purchases, they were making connections. It was clear that the culture of empathy and authenticity that had been cultivated was no longer just an idea. It was the heart of their success. I know I've said this before, but I want to say it again, Blake said, turning to Maggie. Thank you. You've taught me so much, not just about leadership, but about what it really means to care. I wouldn't have gotten here without your guidance. Maggie smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. You're the one who took the first step, Blake. I just gave you a little push in the right direction. But you did the rest. You created something that's bigger than just a dealership. You created a community. Blake felt a swell of pride, but also a deep sense of responsibility. As much as he had changed, he knew that leading this team was a constant journey. It wasn't enough to just get to a place where they were doing well. They had to keep evolving, keep adapting to the world around them. The business world was always changing, and so were the people they served. He had to be ready for that. I know we've made huge strides, but the work's not done yet, Blake said, his voice steady and determined. We've built a great foundation, but now it's about making sure we never lose sight of who we are and why we're doing this. We have to keep pushing forward, always with that same focus on respect and authenticity. Maggie's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his arm. I believe in you, Blake, and I believe in this team. Keep leading with heart. You're already making a bigger impact than you realize. Blake's thoughts drifted to the future, the challenges and the opportunities that lay ahead. He couldn't see the entire path yet, but he knew that as long as they stayed true to their values, they would continue to thrive. The road would never be smooth, but he felt ready for it. He knew that with the team behind him, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. As the day came to a close and the last few customers filtered out, Blake looked out over the showroom one final time. The building was quieter now, but it felt alive with energy, an energy built on trust, empathy, and the kind of connection that couldn't be measured in numbers. Blake knew that this was the kind of legacy he wanted to leave, not just for the dealership, but for the people who had believed in him and for the customers who had walked through those doors, trusting him with their time, their stories, and their needs. This was only the beginning.